As the moderator, I do want to acknowledge that we're gathering today on the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And acknowledging this is really important both for PeaceGeeks but also for myself as a moderator, because how could we talk about peace if we didn't acknowledge the people on whose lands we're gathered today? So thanks to all three of you for being here tonight and for having this conversation with us. Alexander Dirksen here in the middle of the panel is a self-described Métis policy wonk. He works with Reconciliation Canada as a government and stakeholder engagement person, and he's also working as the operations manager with the Band Forum. Previously, he's worked as a nonprofit consultant and researcher in these spaces. And then we have Denise Williams, who is the executive director of the First Nations Technology Council. She is Coast Salish from Cowichan tribes, and she is also an advocate for social justice and for Indigenous sovereignty. And for the last 10 years, she's been working with, under the mandate of First Nations leadership and First Nations communities to address capacity building efforts in education and technology. Jeff Ward, here to my left, is the founder and CEO of Animikii Indigenous Technology, a firm based in Victoria. Jeff is Ojibwe and Métis, originally from Manitoba, but now resides on Vancouver Island on the traditional territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. He's a serial entrepreneur and has launched various businesses. And with Animikii, him and his team provide software, web application, websites, and solutions for leading Indigenous groups. He was also a statement gatherer for Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I can't wait to hear from these three wonderful folks, this amazing panel. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists. And the question that I put to them that we've discussed and landed on to start with is what do reconciliation and Indigenous innovation mean to you in your work and your experience, and how are they linked?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here tonight. I just want to echo Sebastian's opening acknowledgement of the traditional unceded territories upon which we are. As a guest, I want to pay my respect to elders both past and present. Also want to recognize the courage and resiliency of residential school survivors, and also acknowledge the families of the missing or murdered Indigenous women in this country as well. So we're gathered here today to talk about reconciliation and innovation, but I really want to start one step prior to that, which is, what does reconciliation mean to you? And we're gathering here today, it's in the midst of the 150th year of Canadian Confederation, and this is, I believe, is one of the most critical questions that we face as a country, both as individuals and as a country moving forward. It's a question that really challenges preconceived notions that we might have of what it means to be Canadian, and really serves as a call to action for all of us to begin to articulate our role in crafting a future of inclusivity, justice, and equity. So it's been nearly a decade since a national apology was delivered on the floor of the House of Commons to survivors of the residential school system, and 2 years since the release of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Within the report were 94 calls to action, a rallying cry to political, economic, and social institutions to begin the long road towards national healing and renewal. In the ensuing years, change has indeed come. We see it even here within the city of Vancouver, but it's not yet enough. Nor are the calls to action, for all of their value within this space, the singular comprehensive blueprint for reconciliation in this country either. It's often overlooked that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples put forth a 20-year plan to revitalize relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples 2 decades ago in 1996. So we've reached this pivotal juncture in the reconciliation movement, where maintaining its momentum in a meaningful and sustainable way has emerged both as a cause of concern, but also a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to reimagine the future of this country. But to do so, I believe we must move beyond committees and commissions as the impetus for action, challenging the long-standing systems and structures that make up our daily lives. Which brings us to the topic of tonight's discussion. What role can innovation and technology play in the meaningful advancement of reconciliation in Canada? I believe that the opportunities and possibilities are endless, but only if the work is undertaken in a way that empowers Indigenous leaders and communities through representation, pure intention, and clear vision. So I want to spend a few minutes addressing each of these in turn as a foundation for kind of our broader conversation this evening. So the first is representation, because I really think this is where these conversations need to start. So really it begins with who's seated at the proverbial table, or in this context, who has a seat in the circle. Because in order to craft tools of value, the voices of those who will ultimately embrace or reject these tools must be part of the design and development process. Overcoming pervasive and persistent workforce demographic trends in the tech sector is going to pose a considerable challenge in this regard. Looking at Google's latest diversity report, the organization overall is 69% male and 59% white, figures that jump to 76% male and 70% white men when you look at positions of leadership within the organization. So while true in all spaces, this focus on representation is particularly important within the digital space. So many of this country's political, social, and economic structures were shaped in a time and place far different from our own and driven by a limited range of lived experiences. But if you look at what's possible through technology, if you have a vision and a keyboard, you can create a reality that is unconstrained by biases, stereotypes, and constraints that we currently experience in our day-to-day lives. Next is intention. So when we look at the efficacy of an initiative within the reconciliation space, I ask the simple question of reconciliation for whom? And I believe a similar question must be asked for innovation and technology when it's applied to reconciliation. There's a tendency among some Canadians to mistake allyship for aid, overlooking the resiliency, vibrancy, and value that Indigenous voices bring to these conversations. We must be particularly cautious of this oversight when it comes to technology, for despite one's best intentions, we run the risk of replicating ill-fated forays of expert evangelism abroad. One needs to look no further than the failed attempts of Facebook and Google at Internet for All, which its critics have at best labeled as idealistic and at worst a form of digital imperialism. And lastly is the vision. And here I think it's really important because we live in a world of taps, swipes, and clicks, and it's easy to become enchanted by the lure of pixelated progress. But no app will be a panacea for reconciliation in this country. To be effective, technology must be seen as a means with which to strengthen and supplement ongoing efforts within a community. When we speak of connectivity, there is no greater connection than the connection between people, and that needs to be the foundation of all of this work. So when agency, intention, and purpose are aligned, technology can play a pivotal role within the reconciliation space. But if it's successful, one of its most powerful contributions will not be a platform, program, or device, but instead it'll be a philosophy. Steve Jobs once noted that everything around us in the manufactured world has been made by people. You can change it, you can influence it, you can build your own things that other people can use. So imagine for a moment if we embrace this belief, pushing past current preconceptions to actualize a bold vision for reconciliation in our communities and in this country. What if we treated Canada's democratic, legal, and social systems like strings of code created by humans? How would we alter these systems to better reflect Indigenous ways of being and better reflect our hopes for future generations? And as we look boldly to the future and begin to envision ways with which to deepen and sustain our commitment to reconciliation, I just want to close my opening remarks by grounding us with a teaching shared by Justice Murray Sinclair at the inaugural Indigenous Innovation Summit. Innovation isn't always about creating new things or creating new ways of doing things. Innovation sometimes involves looking back at our old ways and bringing them forward to this new situation. I look forward to tonight's conversation of both old and new ways. Thank you.
Wow, that was awesome. I don't have, I'm not as well prepared, but there's some crossover, but thank you. That was really great. So my name is Jeff Ward. Did you want us to introduce ourselves a little bit more? Okay, so I think possibly why I was invited here is I run an Indigenous technology company, and we're a social enterprise, registered B Corp. And yeah, really trying to make sense of this very question, this first question of, what is Indigenous innovation? How does it relate to reconciliation? And I think that's a really big question, and really needs to break down those two things. So reconciliation, for example, we could spend an entire our lifetime discussing what that is. But from my perspective, reconciliation is a coming together, or a coming together again. So looking at the history of this country, we have the early relationships were of mutual prosperity. There were treaties which were nation-to-nation agreements. We have even documented in pieces of art like the wampum belt. I'm not sure if you've seen what a wampum belt is, but it's two streams representing two canoes, not interfering with the other, traveling down the same stream together. So in reconciling, I see that as coming back to a healthy relationship, and definitely we're not in a healthy place in this country. So I'm happy that these conversations are happening, and there is an awakening happening right now in Canada. There's national conversation that's happening, and honestly, all of you who came out here tonight, you're some of the early adopters of these shift in thinking. So I thank you for just showing up, because I think that's a big message. That's a big sign that you're committed to understanding and learning more. So reconciliation, it's been said that you can't have reconciliation without truth. Of course, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So just curious, who here has heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Okay, most people. In Canada, so there was a national poll recently where, conducted by some thought leaders in the space, National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and others, and Canadians, when asked about residential schools, about 66% of people have heard of residential schools, which is probably a lot more than 5 years and 10 years ago, but only 40% have heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And when looking at deeper understanding of Indigenous peoples in Canada, Indigenous ways of knowing and being, Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous worldview, things like the 60s scoop, or the understanding is much, it basically drops off at that point. So there's a lot of surface talk happening about reconciliation, and there's a lot of info out there. So I encourage you to just, do your homework. There's, we were chatting earlier, Google is the thing, it's your best friend. There's so much information out there right now on these topics that really there's no excuse to not be, to be in the dark on these topics. So another quote from Cindy Blackstock, she said, reconciliation is not having to say sorry twice, which I think is really interesting. Because when we look at one of the ways of Indigenous ways of knowing and being is in our innovations are things like restorative justice, making restitution, making things right. And if we do things in a good way, I think we can reconcile, we can come together. So that are my thoughts on reconciliation. So the innovation piece of it. So Indigenous people have been on these territories innovating for millennia, as long as I can remember at least. So, there's many innovations. And when I think of innovation, I think when most people think of innovation, they think of new things, technology, these sort of things, where innovation is more of an umbrella term, I think, and technology is just one way that we can leverage technology for innovation. Indigenous voices are very strong, and we're rising. Our voice is being amplified in the media, and I think with the technology piece of it, social technologies like social media, where we were saying this stuff all along, it just now folks are hearing us loud and clear, sort of thing. And I think that's, when it comes to Indigenous people leveraging technology, this is just the beginning. The work that the Technology Council is doing is just the beginning. There are going to be a lot more Indigenous technologists to supplement and support the work of all the other innovators that are happening within the Indigenous movement. I actually had the same quote written down of Murray Sinclair. Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to say it again, maybe say a third time, but innovation isn't always about creating new things. Innovation sometimes involving looking back to our old ways and bringing them forward. Like I said, we're a very innovative bunch in so many different areas. I mentioned ways, innovation such as restorative justice, economic innovation, health, political, and now technology is a different way that I say it's my tool of choice, my weapon of choice. Maybe not weapon, that's a little too harsh, but it's my tool of choice. Yeah, okay, we gotta fight back. So I think that's all I'll say now as far as innovation goes and how that relates to reconciliation, but it is really a multi-layered, each topic, it's huge, and I think it's just, this is like tip of the iceberg stuff. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a quote now, so, but, welcome to Coast Salish Territories, everyone. Thank you for coming here this evening. My name is Denise Williams. I am Coast Salish. I'm from Cowichan, the home of the best sweaters in the world. And, don't listen to what VANOC 2010 told you. I am the Executive Director of the First Nations Technology Council, the Vice President of the Urban Native Youth Association. I've been living in Vancouver for 16 years. Love the work that we're doing here in Gastown in technology and social innovation. Very much appreciate my colleagues spending time with us here this evening. I think these are the leading minds in reconciliation and innovation. A little bit about the Technology Council. We've been around since 2002. I've been the Executive Director for a few years now. I always say 2, but I think it's 4. Yeah, 5, I don't know. So, time goes by so quickly. A lot of the work that we do is building the Indigenous innovation ecosystem, as we like to say. And as my colleagues have pointed out, Indigenous people are the original technologists and innovators on these territories, and we're yet to really understand what their contribution is. And, I think it's really important that we spend the next few years, as we see technology being the fastest growing sector in British Columbia, the biggest employer. I come from a family of foresters. My dad's a logger and my mom's a truck driver, the perfect BC forestry love story. It didn't work out, so don't get too romanticized about it. But here I am, anyways. But things changed. I grew up in Haida in a logging camp, and I knew pretty young that I didn't quite have the build to be a faller or a machine operator. But what really stood out to me in thinking about my experience growing up in Haida as a young Indigenous girl is I didn't know what opportunities were really available to me. You don't know what you don't know. If you don't know lawyers and you don't know doctors and you don't know dentists in your life, you don't really know those are education opportunities. And it was the 80s, so there was no internet, and certainly no internet in Haida. That's still a thing that I'm going on about today. So moving to Vancouver Island and having access to something more than a gold leaf encyclopedia set was really something, in my own evolution of understanding what I could do, where I could contribute. And my parents foolishly let me have a computer in my room in the 1990s. That was before parents really knew what computers were really all about. And that, I don't know if anyone remembers 90s chat rooms, but they were a funny thing. Anyways, I tell you this because there are still a lot of, the majority of young Indigenous people living in remote communities lived very much the way that I did in 1984. And they don't have access to the internet, and they don't have access to the vast body of knowledge that the rest of the world does. And what does that mean? And how will that digital divide continue to create socioeconomic disparity in the society? And in the time of exponential growth of technology, we're talking about generations missing out on participation in this economy, and it's not okay. So I think that there's a few things that are happening. I think there's a lack of political will. I think there's a lack of will from the industry to make things different. And I think there's a lack of awareness. And in this time of reconciliation, as we talk about what we can do individually, it's also important to talk about what we can do collectively to turn that dial, to move the needle, as we all talk about. And I very much appreciate the words from my colleagues about who's at the table, who's not at the table, who's not in the circle. It's very easy to not see what's happening in northern British Columbia. It's something that a lot of us don't have to face every day. We talk about often at the Technology Council that connectivity in some First Nations communities is the same as being in P3 of Pacific Center, if you've ever tried to get a cell signal there. It's the same thing. Imagine how outraged you are, when a call drops. For some First Nations in BC, they have to walk out onto a point, 6 kilometers down the road just to be able to make a phone call. So, maybe I have no, it's not a quote. But I watched a documentary that meant a lot to me about Aaron Swartz. And, Aaron Swartz paid the ultimate price for releasing a number of documents from academic institutions to the hands of the public, because he believed that access to information should be for everybody, and it shouldn't just belong to the most privileged. And years later, after he'd passed away, I read the story about a kid in grade 11 or 12 had been sifting through the documents that Aaron Swartz had released from JSTOR, and he had an idea for early detection of colon cancer. And he had read through these documents and actually come up with a theory and come up with a process. And he shopped this to a number of different scientists and professors. And I think the vast majority thought, here's this kid from grade 11 or grade 12, I can't remember, but they didn't take him very seriously. Years later, a couple of years later, when I think he was in college, it ended up that he actually did find an early detection mechanism for colon cancer, and that's the one that's used in North America today. And he talks about the fact that because Aaron Swartz released these documents, he was able to vastly expedite his knowledge, and he was able to find solutions and validations to what he understood scientifically at a very young age. My point is, we don't know the most brilliant minds in the world, and they're not always the ones with all the money and all the privilege. And we very much miss out on what Indigenous people have to offer in ways of thinking, in ways of knowing, in ways of being, and in all of these ways that we long for a better economy, for a better world, for better social connection. Indigenous people have a lot to say and a lot to offer about how that's been done since time immemorial on these territories. So the First Nations Technology Council spends a lot of time thinking about access to information, about how to inspire and engage young Indigenous people to be a part of this, to have them be content contributors online, and to ensure that they are shaping and co-creating the future, not only participating in British Columbia's tech sector, in Canada's tech sector, but leading. Thank you.
Thanks to all three of you for laying this field of ideas and insights out here. And this is always the point where I regret that I said I was only going to ask you a few questions, because I have at least 5 or 6 that I would love to ask. but I'm trying to limit myself to a few. Denise, you've finished nicely on this note of all the opportunities that are there to actually give people access to ideas, to the possibilities that are out there, to have them participate in the new economy and the opportunities that are being shaped right now. But you also mentioned that there is a lack of will and a lack of awareness to actually overcome the hurdles to that. So my question is, what is needed to overcome those? And if I use Alexander's beautiful metaphor there, what is needed to fix that string of code or to rewrite it so we can actually provide those opportunities in an equitable way?
Yeah, I wrote that down. That might be the new quote I open with. Yeah, I'll make sure to note you. What's needed? Yeah, to be frank amongst friends, we have. There's no shortage of money. If money and government could solve problems, we'd be all right. There's no shortage of money to connect communities. We look at the estimated rough cost, if we're just talking about cost of connecting communities. It's somewhere up around $250 million to do the infrastructure build into First Nations communities in British Columbia. There's 203 communities here. Most of them are small, remote, isolated. Some of them aren't, but a lot of them are. So building fiber, terrestrial fiber into those locations is it's a job. BC has an interesting geography. It's not like the rest of Canada. Sometimes I visit my colleagues in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and I always come back, just so jealous of their lovely flat land where they can put up a tower and everybody has 50 megabits. But what's really interesting along the 50 megabits vein is that CRTC just passed a decision which says that it's now a basic service that all Canadians have access to 50 megabits download and 10 up. To date, our provincial government has considered high-speed connectivity 5 megabits down and 2 up. So that's not enough to stream Netflix, basically, or download software or anything like that. So what's happening in British Columbia is a lot of work and a lot of money has gone in over the last 10 years to getting to 5 megabits. So what does it take to get to 50? And what I mean by political will and will from the industry is the incumbent in the province doesn't have necessarily a business case to want to connect 203 remote communities that aren't necessarily all going to pay the $75 a month subscription fee. And the provincial government doesn't have, and the federal government doesn't have an adequate way of looking at how to cover the operational costs, the sustainable costs. So even if you were to spend $250 million putting the infrastructure in, how are those communities going to sustain that connection? The thing that bothers me is that almost everywhere else in the world has solved that problem. Nobody's asking remote Indigenous communities to pay, in one example, $10,000 a month for the internet. So while we see that CRTC decision playing in, which could take another 10 years, we don't know exactly what those solutions are going to be, and that's the work that the Technology Council is trying to be at the forefront of. How do we ensure that the voices of those who are living on the margins are going to be served and not left unserved unless they can afford the cost to be subscribers to TELUS? So, it's a matter of social justice, and it's a matter of human right, and it matters, and people should know that that's what's happening. So I think that's what needs to happen. I think that there needs to be a better model.
It strikes me that I'm hearing a lot of a need for changing the narrative around this issue. Right? What is this actually about? And we need people to understand the narrative, to actually ask for those changes. And that kind of connects me with some of the things that Alexander and Jeff have said. So from your perspective, what does it take to address these issues? What does it take to change that narrative around innovation and reconciliation? Whoever wants to take it.
Well, the talk tonight is Indigenous innovation. We've already chatted a little bit about the Indigenous voice and the contributions of Indigenous peoples in Canada, past and present. So I think framing that the discussion within Indigenous innovation, there are a lot of innovators out there innovating in all of these sectors, technology, education, health, and so on. And I learned something recently about the law of diffusion of innovation, where to reach a tipping point, you sort of need, there are a lot of different players that will adopt new ideas. And if you were to plot it on a bell curve, broken it up into innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and the laggards. I was reading this book, they call them the laggards. Basically, don't be a laggard. In a typical scenario, I was reading, there was like 2.5% sort of innovate and create ideas, and then it's the early adopters, which is like 15 or so percent kind of latch on to an idea. I see a lot of the people in this room as innovators and early adopters. You're early adopters of the Indigenous contributions or the potential to have Indigenous perspectives on innovation in Canada. So, long story short, giving voice to Indigenous people, amplifying Indigenous people's voices in all sectors and in all systems.
Yeah, I would just add to that and say that I think in terms of changing the narrative, particularly around reconciliation, I often say reconciliation is a gift, not an obligation. And I think there's so much that we can, non-Indigenous and Indigenous, that knowledge sharing that happens, I think is incredible. And I think when we look at innovation being applied within reconciliation, it goes back to my comment about allyship versus aid. It's really about how do we make sure this is in a way that it's a mutual benefit, and it's a conversation between two groups rather than us looking down upon a community that might not have access to the internet. And so there's some great examples of this already. There's some incredible work happening right now in Australia around the Indigenous peoples there and what they've managed to do with technology and the intergenerational knowledge transfer that's happened through technology, the connection between community members that have left communities to go study abroad and have that connection back home. And there's all of these ways in which it can really strengthen reconciliation and also demonstrate to the outside community really what's possible through some of this work as well. But I think it's really about, like I said, shifting that conversation from being one of how can we help a remote Indigenous community to one, how can we engage in this mutual dialogue for mutual benefit?
Thank you so much. Another question that really strikes me when we have this conversation around innovation and reconciliation is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes a focus on innovation, I think, has the risk of distracting from addressing some of those structural inequities and forms of oppression that we're facing. Alexander was mentioning those in his opening remarks too. So how do we ensure that that's not happening? How do we integrate the innovation piece and addressing the past wrongs and addressing the structure that still exists that prevent us from moving forward? Any thoughts on that?
The concept of you can't have reconciliation before truth. Truth coming from a place of education. We need innovation across so many systems, but I believe education, which was the thing that got us into this mess, residential schools, etc. This is where this needs to be transformed, because I'm sure many people in this room, like myself, did not hear about residential schools in the education system. So that's what I would say. Start with the education system. Truth.
I don't know that innovation distracts. So I was just kind of grappling with maybe that idea. I think that Jeff's absolutely correct. There's a lot behind the truth piece that needs to be done, and that's work that everybody needs to undertake. And I think it's powerful to watch so many people raise their hands when asked if they've heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think it's more powerful to see every hand go up in the room, to know how many of you have read it. Good for you. It's a long document. It takes a lot of hours, and it takes a lot of time. It's not something you can read quickly. And I think as you start to understand what that history is, that belongs to all of us, the idea of innovation to me is very much, it's a way forward, and I think that we have to be focused on that, and it's not one, without the other. I very much believe that these things can happen at the same time, and in a lot of cases I think it should, because I think when we read something as devastating as what happened in residential schools, and I come from a family of residential school survivors as well. It's very much a difficult. It's a difficult place in terms of understanding who you are. It's whether you're, a settler, or you're an Indigenous person, or you're somebody who's been intergenerationally affected by residential school. This all plays into our identity. How do we fit into this? How do our ancestors fit into this? And how does that affect us today? Now, what are we going to do? And I think that there's a real longing on all sides to understand this, because we have to come together as people and as a province and as a nation. If we're really going to, be a place of home and safety and family for each other. So I think this idea of innovation comes along with it, because it's to me that next instinct, right? Like how do we work together then to make all of this better? And that technology piece, that's just the place. It's that place of exponential growth, like I say, where there's more freedom to design and to co-create and to think about, social innovation. And social innovation being, how can we make this a better world for all of us? It sets a perfect platform for this. And so it's a place where there's a little more space, I think, for that type of dialogue.
Yeah, I mentioned at the start of my opening remarks just about the year that we're in, right? This being the 150th year of Confederation. And I think if we look at the history of the country thus far, those in positions of power and privilege have done a lot of talking. And I think going into the next 150 years, it's going to have to start with a bit more listening. And I think really, particularly amongst social change makers, innovators, those that are sort of working in the tech space, it's a lot of rapid prototyping, iteration, and moving very quickly into jumping into action. And I think this is a space where, like Denise mentioned, the fact that so many of you have read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I believe it starts with that. I believe there's a piece about educating yourself, educating those in your life, and really making sure that before you jump immediately into action and start, you race to the whiteboard to start brainstorming some ideas, that you really understand our shared history, that you understand where we are in this country. Denise mentioned sort of connectivity. We're dealing with over 100 boil water advisories in this country, let alone internet access. And so these are issues that continue to play out. There's more Indigenous children in care now than the height of the residential school system. These are facts that before you start any sort of prototyping or iteration, you need to become aware of, because that will guide your work and make sure that you're going about this work in a good way.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you stressed the idea of truth being part of it, and Jeff was the first one to bring that up. And I've also heard you speak about listening, about education, understanding. And those seem to be key elements of moving forward. Now, what we've seen in the last year, or at least last years, is also that the internet, the digital space, isn't always a place where that happens. There is the potential for misinformation and for lack of understanding, and there's not always a lot of listening happening. So my last question is a fairly big one, but I'd love to hear your take on how do we prevent that from happening? How do we make sure that in those digital spaces we are actually listening and learning and understanding rather than the opposite?
I'll just start by acknowledging that we're not even a week away from the appropriation prize taking the internet. I think it's a very relevant question. I think we're very much grappling with what that looks like. I think there's a question of how do we go about these conversations in a meaningful way, but also in a way that doesn't rest so heavily upon Indigenous people. It should not always be up to Indigenous people to educate non-Indigenous people about our history, about reconciliation. Jeff mentioned Google. Like there's a certain amount of ownership that we all have to take around some of this work as well. And we can't just be looking to Indigenous voices to constantly fill those gaps in our knowledge. And I think that's a huge piece of the conversation online as well, is I see it all the time on Twitter. How do we make sure that there isn't that pressure for Indigenous voices to have to speak up and defend points of view or explain pieces of our history? So I think that's a huge piece.
Picking up on some of the negative aspects of us moving into digital spaces, where there's a lot of misinformation happening, a lot of talking at each other rather than talking to each other and listening, misinformation. How do we prevent that from happening?
I don't think you can.
So what do we do then? How do we grapple with that? How do we counterbalance it?
Yeah, I think what's weird about the online space, and I'm always somewhat concerned. My point is I don't have an answer, so I'm not going to land on one. But I'm always somewhat concerned about how online spaces are being used for influence and for power, and I think in a lot of ways it can almost represent the most ugly side of humanity and our society because it's so anonymous. And so if there's a feeling that you have, or there's some way you want to sway the public, you can do that without much backlash, or without much opportunity for truth and for someone to respond. And I think that that's really, particularly recently, I think that's really concerning. And I think for Indigenous people, there's a lot. Jeff and I were talking about this earlier today. I think that there's a lot. I read some article a couple of years ago that there's more about Indigenous people online than there is created by Indigenous people online. But again, that's representative of just the world we're living in. So what I do know is that I'm inspired on a daily basis by Indigenous youth and young people. And anyone who knows me knows that there's nothing more that I like than a kid that doesn't really follow the rules and is a little bit out of hand. Those are my favorite kids, because I know that those are the ones that are going to have the resilience and the voice and the fearlessness to say how they feel. And I want that. I want that for Indigenous youth and for our kids, because that silence is violence. And I love hearing what they have to say. 100% on just what I want to spend every day on is making sure that we're strengthening those voices, that we are creating exemplars, making space for exemplars, young Indigenous people to come out and create music, create media, create content, start in the ways that they want to educate the world on who they are and what matters to them, make space for that. And I think they are going to have, and I've already seen it, they're going to have people make negative comments. There's trolls. That's what happens online. But it's not a reason not to participate. It's not preventable, but like everything in life, you build a resilience and you keep going. The voice gets stronger, the movement gets larger, and people start to understand more about who Indigenous people are, and really value what we bring to the world in an online space. So that's my thought.
So I have one of those. I have one of those kids who is just, a little edgy. He speaks his mind, almost to a fault, or maybe not to a fault. I think you get along really well with him. We brush up against teachers and principals and that sort of thing because he's a very honest person. He's got that justice instinct, social justice, and he'll he speaks up for people in less privileged situations than himself. So he gets himself into trouble there. And so the tools that will be available to him as he becomes a man and gets his voice and contributes to the conversation, I'm super excited for that. So the one thing I did prepare around this is, so Indigenous perspectives and voices have largely been excluded from Canada, from history books, politics, and the media. Social technology has totally changed. It's a decentralized network to share and collaborate on ideas, but the system of the media and those who hold power are losing that power. And Indigenous Rising, Indigenous are rising. Sorry, there's a hashtag Indigenous Rising. Look it up. It's a good one. Speaking of hashtags, before I get to the hashtag thing, as a result of that, we're getting our voice back. Not to say that we never had a voice. We've been having these discussions around our kitchen tables for decades. It's just, like I said earlier, now you folks are just hearing it. You're hearing our voices because we have a platform which is powered by the social technology, as evidence with movements like the Idle No More movement, hashtag Idle No More, the No DAPL, movement, and even hashtag MMIWG, Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. We've always had a voice, and now you're hearing it in new and different ways. So there's social media, there's podcasting, there's some amazing Indigenous thought leaders that you can just subscribe to. Like we don't need approval from big media network. We can just grab a mic and share with the world. And even now we're seeing within the national media, for example, within CBC, we have some Indigenous personalities or hosts of shows like Duncan McHugh and Candy Palmater. Wab Canoe was a voice. Yeah, exactly. And there are a lot of voices now that are leading conversations now. It's a very exciting time.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to open it up to the audience for your questions, for your thoughts on this topic.
My question, I was just wondering, I work in the tech sector here, and I was just kind of curious, I'm not sure if this was kind of one of the topics that was talked about, but do you guys have suggestions as to how to kind of get more people involved in the tech, in terms of employment opportunities in the tech sector for people that are kind of have been left behind, and what your guys' organizations do for that kind of situation, and it's specifically employing people? Yeah.
Excellent question, Tucker. It's almost like I paid him to ask that question. We think about that a lot. The Technology Council has been involved in digital skills development work all across the province for about 5 years. So we've had over 2,000 people on reserve taking digital skills training because we want more individuals to work in the tech sector in organizations like yours. So we've participated in a bunch of labor market studies on the tech sector in British Columbia, and we've got a sense of where SMEs are playing a strong role. I don't know if you work for a larger tech, yeah. So kind of an SME, and one of the challenges there is that there's varying levels of infrastructure mechanism that you have for internships and co-ops and that sort of thing. That's our understanding from being part of some labor market studies. So what we've done is we've built a Bridging to Technology initiative that's going to be province-wide, and the idea is to give Indigenous people on and off reserve the opportunity to see what tech sector jobs look like that are going to be in demand, because we know that there's a huge talent shortage in British Columbia in the tech sector, and we know that there's all kinds of organizations like yours that are asking that question. We'd love to, we just don't know what to do. So we're creating a talent pool of Indigenous people that will have the skills from bridging to technology to know what they're interested in. Then they'll have the opportunity to move on to an internship in places like yours. If your company was interested in participating, you could let me know, or my colleague Lauren here, and we'll get in touch. Absolutely. We have a great advisory committee, and we have a big group of SMEs like yours in British Columbia that are interested in helping us to design our program to make sure we're creating talent that's going to be competitive and that are going to, match up with exactly what you're looking for. That's a 5-year-long strategy, and we're just starting now. So we're looking for partners. So anyway, just come talk to us after. Or anyone else who's also in the tech sector.
You want to jump in? Yeah.
Sure. So I run an Indigenous technology company. More than half of us are Indigenous at the company. And I'm very proud to say that we employ one of the former grads of the Bridging to Technology training program, which is working out really awesome. So when I started Animikii 13, 14 years ago, there was nobody else doing a tech business focused within the Indigenous community. It was a very lonely time for a long time. Almost gave up several times and shifted to different business models and that sort of thing. In the last couple of years, we've had tremendous growth within our company, and more and more faces are coming to us with very eager, really supportive of the mission of what we're doing within our company. And it's totally different landscape than 5-10 years ago. We had a job listing for a Ruby on Rails developer, and I was surprised how many more Indigenous technologists there are out there, and they were just coming out of the woodwork, and I'm like, whoa, I felt alone for so long. And a lot of them, they're very young, very early in their careers. And so yeah, if I also have as a result of that, I have a list of Indigenous technologists at various skill levels and interests. So come grab a card. I can connect you with people as well.
Hi, my name is Oscar. I run innovation consulting firm here in Vancouver. And essentially what we do is we form innovation teams with people with different backgrounds. And so right now we're actually trying one program where we take new Canadians, recent arrivals in Canada, with their expertise, with their talent, as they are, and we form innovation task forces, and we sell those innovation task forces, to big corporations, Telos, Microsoft, all those. So the idea is basically to foster corporate innovation by means of having external perspectives injected into their processes, into their ways of doing business. I would love to actually talk to you to see if we can actually have First Nations individuals as they are. They don't have to be qualified, or they don't have to be Ruby on Rails developers, because we believe that that wisdom, that knowledge, that expertise, that experience is inherently different from what we can offer. And thus, we can immediately exploit that value added almost right away. So the question for you is, do you have any program for co-creation or co-development of sorts that speaks to this objective? Thanks.
Yeah, well, a big part of the development of bridging technology is to think about how we can open up a world of experiences that are going to be relevant to the Indigenous people experiencing technology, and those types of, hackathon challenges or experiential challenges and co-creating something in the technology sector. The idea has been brought forward to me by some of those partners that you've mentioned before, and I'm absolutely interested, of course. I think that there's something in there, to ensure that we're doing that in a respectful, mindful way. So I'm an Indigenous woman who's been part of the tech sector for a few years. I'm not a technologist, but I'm certainly trying to, push into some of these conversations and organizations, and groups that are having these conversations about talent, about, ways in which we can engage Indigenous perspectives. One word you used, exploit, is one that is a dangerous one and can often start to create a space in which Indigenous ways of knowing and seeing and being and that offering of knowledge can start to feel like it's not okay.
I'll have to clarify there my point. For us, and I've been doing this for a number of years, I used to work for Microsoft doing exactly this. So I use that word to describe the extraction of talent no matter who you are. You can be a purple blob from Jupiter, and if you have talent, you are of value. So that's what I mean. So I didn't really try to denigrate or try to, again, exploit specific talent.
Yeah, I love this conversation because I'm not talking about purple blood from Jupiter. Like, it's about Indigenous people on these lands who have a right to a certain knowledge base, which I very much appreciate that it's welcome in all forms in the technology sector. The thing that terrifies me is that it's not adequately respected. And so it's what keeps me up at night, is that there's a lot of work to do, and that's why I'm going to pass the microphone over to Alexandra after this. There's a lot of work to do in reconciliation. This is exactly the conversation we're having this evening. How do we set up opportunities for the tech sector to become aware of the type of language, and I'm not saying that you're part of, I don't know you, but that the tech sector is aware and educated and sensitive, because the thing that I hear the most is this is a very diverse sector. We've got a diversity program. It's, we've done it, check. And that's not the case when you're including Indigenous people into the technology sector. Diversity is a broad term. Inclusion is a whole other thing. And this is what we're beginning to grapple with. And the thing that I'm finding is that at the CEO level, at the vice president level, people are getting it. When it comes down to the operational level, it might be a diverse culture, but it's very homogeneous. It's very, there's a culture in the tech sector, and we have to be careful about Indigenous people entering into it, because there's not a lot of shared values at the moment. That's my belief.
Thank you for raising that. So I'd love to hear from Alexandra and Jeff too about how to do that in a respectful way.
Yeah, I think just starting even at the personal level, as a young Métis male, have at times not identified as Métis because I fear that there's a special privilege or status that comes with that. And that being Indigenous in any form, First Nations, Indigenous, or Inuit or Métis, that is what is identified as the value add that you have for an organization and not your actual skill set. I think we're seeing this across the business community in Canada right now. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce, I think, just put out a report echoing some of these things as well. And there was a report last year as well, looking at basically Indigenous peoples as a resource, as an untapped economic resource for this country. And when we talk about extraction, when we talk about exploitation, it is very much continuing, I think, a historical trend of seeing Indigenous peoples as something that can be exploited by the dominant privileged people in society. And so I think it goes back to my point around how do we go about reconciliation in a good and meaningful way, is that we have to be walking together. And this cannot be, like I said, allyship over aid. It cannot be this dynamic where Indigenous people are tapped upon just for being Indigenous. There's an incredible amount of skill and value in Indigenous people in this country, regardless of what form of indigeneity they identify with. So that's sort of my initial thoughts.
So being Indigenous in the tech sector, and I guess in this, I'm going to tell a story. It's about me going to like a mainstream tech event recently. But before I get into that, So the concept of diversity versus inclusion, multiculturalism, just in general in Canada, you know, Canada celebrates itself for being very multicultural and being diverse, and it's a really beautiful idea. It's you know, the idea where you know, we're all unity and diversity. We're all just, you know, different shades. You know, I don't care who you are, what color, that sort of thing. You know, we're all Canadians, that sort of thing. Which is great and beautiful. When it comes to Indigenous people on these lands, on these traditional territories framed within this colonial history, by lumping in Indigenous people into this multicultural, beautiful idea, what it does is it disappears the past. It gets everybody at the same playing level, which is what multiculturalism is intended to do. But for Indigenous peoples, it kind of, just like, you know, that's the past, we're move on. Now we're on equal footing and we can move forward. So within the tech sector, so this was just a couple weeks ago, I went to a very, what's the word? Swanky, high-end, highfalutin, sort of big tech event. There was over 600 people there. Most people were wearing tuxedos, that sort of thing. The women were dressed in ball gowns and blingy diamonds, and you know, the whole thing. And I knew this was the case going there. And if I ever wear a suit, I'm doing it ironically, because it's just not sort of who I am. So I was sitting at a table of Indigenous business leaders within the community where I live, and I thought, you know, I'm not about to go rent a tux. I'm gonna wear my beaded necklace that my dad gave me. It has a thunderbird on it. My Indigenous name is Animikii Kiwizans, which is Thunderbird Boy, deep meaning to me. And I wear my moose hide pin here. We both have moose hides, so this is the moose hide campaign, which I'll tell you about in a second. And I was going to the bathroom. Somebody called me over who I knew and introduced me to a local tech leader within the community, really well-respected individual. And he's like, "Oh, this is Jeff Ward, blah blah." So and he's like, "Whoa, so what's all this stuff?" And he reaches and he grabs my beaded necklace and he's like flicking it, and he's like, "Wow, this is pretty crazy." And then he goes to my moose hide here and he's like, "Oh, what's this?" He's like flicking it. And I said, "This is moose hide." "Oh, really? That's pretty crazy, hey?" Because, you know, everyone else is like wearing diamonds and all sort of thing. And I just let him know this moose hide is to raise awareness of violence towards Indigenous women and girls. And just sort of like flat face and like, oh, okay, you know. So, you know, he wasn't going around to the women and flicking their diamonds up and reaching to other men's ties, and I certainly wasn't playing with his tie. But for somehow, Indigenous culture, Indigenous people, get sort of a pass to it's devalued, and I worry as Indigenous people get more into the tech sector, and you know, framed with this whole concept of diversity, multiculturalism, you know, that's just in my gut a little bit of a worry, just based off of, you know, one experience that I've had just in the last couple of weeks. So that's my story I wanted to share. Wasn't sure I was going to share that. It's pretty new. I'm still a little worked up about it. So thank you for letting me vent.
If there's other questions in the room. Is there a question? Can I give you the microphone?
Sure, very carefully. So I was just wondering, for those who are involved in hosting tech-focused events, like for example, like this one tonight, or sometimes I host like open data hackathons, things like that. Like, how can we help, or how can we include First Nations in it, but making sure, given what you said, that like it's that kind of culturally safe place, like you're not just inviting them for the sake of inviting them, but how do you create that kind of safe space and go about actually embracing them and the stuff that you're doing when you notice it's not happening naturally?
Thank you.
So the big thing I've been seeing at conferences I've been attending is there will be a reconciliation panel where all of the Indigenous voices are placed, and then you'll have a panel, say, on global affairs or business or something, as if those panels wouldn't benefit from Indigenous voices, or as if business and global affairs don't impact Indigenous people or vice versa. So the big thing I would say is just avoiding the tokenism and really, like I said before, taking Indigenous peoples as people with valuable contributions and not just slotting them all onto a single panel and checking a box of we've had Indigenous voices within our conference or event.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that question because I think that there's a lot of learning that we can do. I'm interested in what you're talking about, and what might these events be, and how could they benefit, some of the Indigenous people involved in our programs and things like that. And I think a really good starting place is just to talk with the First Nations Technology Council, other people involved in Indigenous technology, people who, run these types of companies, and just, make that phone call and reach out and ask questions and, kind of see how can we, learn about what you're doing, and you can kind of learn about what we're doing and see, just how that might work on the ground, while understanding that sometimes these intersections are kind of new. So how can we in the leadership positions ensure that we're thinking about what some of those outcomes might be and how we might steer conversations about these things? How can we, have conversations nice and early about what tokenism might look like? If there's, going to be any concern about, the crowd wanting to ask a lot of questions about Indigenous people and cultures, and kind of shining up all the Indigenous people and putting them into the crowd, and, them having to feel sort of like, now I answer for all Indigenous people. That's really uncomfortable. So, I think that there's a large leadership responsibility and due diligence to have a good conversation before, and in the long term, that's what, to me, for the Technology Council is the contribution to reconciliation is, knowing people like you and your organizations, and how can we, just work together to navigate those waters together.
So I'm Matthew. I study at UBC. How do you see, in spite of, policies and lack of resources and what we see in the status quo, how are we making sure that, you're still trying to build the foundations for the newer generations of Indigenous peoples to participate in the conversation, to understand about, to have just as many opportunities and resources to make themselves heard, and also have the knowledge to innovate.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think very important and timely right now. And I would say, in terms of the policy angle, I come from a policy background, so I'm quite frustrated with where we're at as a country when it comes to some of the policy progress. But in its purest and best form, democracies reflect the country that they serve. So for me, when it comes to reconciliation, we don't have to wait for the government. It starts with people like this in this room who are willing to start to engage in this work in a meaningful way. If we keep doing that, if we keep having these conversations, if everybody in this room goes home and has a similar conversation with somebody that you know, and this starts to spread, the government is going to be put in a position where there's a loud and growing voice of people who are asking for these opportunities to be created, asking for a change in a lot of the policies that we see, and we'll have to do something. So to me, we are, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're at this critical juncture where we need to be finding a way to make this sustainable and to keep momentum. And to me, we can't be waiting for the government. We need to be, each of us, finding a way of moving this work forward.
What was your name? I didn't... Matthew. Well, thank you for the land acknowledgement, and that was a really well-articulated, thoughtful question. Thank you. I agree. I think that what I've seen as a not-for-profit that's trying to do a lot of the work that, arguably the federal government has a fiduciary responsibility to, can be quite frustrating, and the policies and the institutions that are set up are not designed to create strong, self-determining nations, and there's a lot of work to be done, and I really hold my hands up and acknowledge the people who are working at that level, because it is incredibly frustrating. But the one thing that I've seen that can be quite powerful is when people, when organizations, when industries get behind these movements, when it's people like you and your organizations that start to follow the work of the BC Assembly of First Nations and the First Nations Summit and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, paying attention to what they're trying to do, what they're trying to push forward, what organizations like Reconciliation Canada are doing, and being part of that. It comes back to what's been said. That's really what standing beside and being an ally is about. Be engaged, be educated, get behind it, get mad, be part of it with us, because when industries start to raise this at the provincial and federal level, that this matters, that Indigenous people in my organization matters, and I want to move my tech sector business out of Vancouver and to northern BC, and Indigenous people are there, and I know that I have to figure out a way to engage those Indigenous people there to make that business viable. That's what makes the government listen. That's what creates change. And reconciliation isn't only about Indigenous voices. It's about our voices together asking for change in a comprehensive, collaborative way. So I really appreciate that question. I think it's a difficult one, but I think it's the right one.
But I'd like to thank you again for being here and for sharing your insights and for putting yourself out there. Big round of applause, please, for our panelists. Thank you very much, and again, thanks to you for being here, and thanks for PeaceTalks, the First Nations Technology Council, Amnesty International, and the HiVE for putting this on tonight.